Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here with us. Before I introduce my special guest today, whom I never had pleasure to have conversation with before, so this is a very special moment for me, I would like to remind you all to join me on Locals, join my mailing list, and follow me on Instagram, because if anything happens, those three places are to know what's going on. So the links you find down below this video. And now I would like to introduce someone who many of my viewers don't really need to have introduced, because this is gentleman Larry Johnson, who you've seen on the Duran many times, who is close friend of Andrei Martyanov, whom, by the way, I thank you officially here for connecting me with Larry. And welcome, Larry. Thank you so much for finding time to have this chat with me.
It is a pleasure, Anya.
So let me ask you first, before we start with my questions, what is the best way if people would like to follow your work and the information that you provide to the public? What platforms they should go and look for you?
I have a blog, sonar21.com. I also post at Patreon and at Substack, but the blog is my principal platform.
Okay, so I will attach this down below our video. And I would like to say, as I came across this information that you worked for the CIA, how many years,
Correct.
Larry, was it exactly? 4 years or more?
So let me give you just a quick rundown. I started with the Central Intelligence Agency in September of 1985. Spent the first year in what they called a career trainee program, which basically gave you exposure to all, at that time, 4 directorates of the CIA. I was part of a group of 53 people. One of them was Valerie Plame. Valerie is, I didn't know her as Plame at the time. It was Valerie P, because we only used our last initials of our last names. After that, I continued to work for 3 more years at the Central Intelligence Agency. I left in 1989 at the end of September, moved to the U.S. Department of State and Counterterrorism. It was sort of funny because when I was at the CIA, I was undercover my cover was State Department. Then I really was State Department. And I figured out the way you could figure out, you could know who was really a State Department employee as opposed to someone pretending to be, was they would always have a real business card with State Department emblems on it. So I was at the State Department for 4 years, and then was downsized by Bill Clinton. They decided that the counterterrorism area didn't need any more workers. So I became a consultant in 1994, and have had a consulting business since then. So it's going on 29 years now. Doing financial investigations, I spent 23 years doing training, scripting exercises for the U.S. military special operations forces. So this diverse background, by working at the CIA, both on the operations side, on the intelligence analysis side, working in an interagency environment. When I moved to state, my activities involved transportation security. So I was involved with both aviation and maritime. I was coordinating and providing liaison support to the FBI, who was investigating the bombing of Pan Am 103, and then involved with the terrorism rewards program. Then when I went into providing extensive exercise support to the U.S. military and to really the most elite of America's military forces, and did that for 23 years, I have a unique perspective, because I sort of got to see how the whole machine works, not just one aspect. Many people will go into government and stay only in one area, like FBI or as a CIA operations officer. And they don't get the advantage of seeing and understanding how these different entities work. So it puts me in sort of a unique position to understand a lot of things that the average person wouldn't see. As an example, when I saw that the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum in Sudan had 70 people. I was going, what? That that's a large number of people, because in the normal embassy, you have your ambassador, you have the number two person, usually a foreign service officer called the deputy chief of mission. Then you'll have an admin chief, somebody keeps the lights on and pays the bills. Then you have four other cones, as they call them in the State Department. You have an economic officer, you have a political officer, you have an econ officer, and now they've added a new one, public relations, public diplomacy. So, usually in a country the size of Sudan, given it's not an important country in terms of the economics of the United States. It's not a critical military ally by any stretch. So you wouldn't necessarily have lots of the positions there. And then you got consular affairs. Let's not forget that. The consular affairs element is where people go in and get their visa. But again, the people of Sudan are not lining up to travel to the United States in the way that, say, somebody from Egypt might. So it was highly unusual. And so when I saw that, I knew immediately that the most likely explanation, Sudan was being used as a logistics base, a support base of some sort by my old employer, the Central Intelligence Agency, to provide support to what was going on in the war in Yemen. So it's just, I have some insights like that you see something that's sort of just doesn't make sense, because recognize the number of people they got at the embassy in Khartoum is almost the same number as are at the embassy in Kiev.
Yeah, but your timing working there, it's very important for me also, Larry. You know why? Because I will start with Poland. And I would like to ask you this. When CIA has really entered Poland, was it in 1980 when they started with Solidarity movement? And then it was created, was it a color revolution in Poland? Was it hijacked, or it was created by CIA, Solidarity? And was Wałęsa really a puppet, and maybe still is? Also, my second thought was, or maybe perhaps the main role of CIA in Poland was in 1989, right after the round table negotiations. So those two questions are like the beginning of our conversation, because they will set a tone for a lot of events that's taking place in Poland right now.
I have some personal experience in this regard as far as sort of the development of the relationship. I have no doubt that the CIA was, did have a presence in Warsaw and was trying to identify sources and recruit agents, assets. But the reality is, despite all the jokes in in America, as you know, about the Polish joke, or is it the term Polak, which is insulting. The reality is that the Polish intelligence services were one of the best in the world. And in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was involved with one of my jobs in the State Department Office of Counterterrorism was providing policy guidance for the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Training Program. And my boss, who is a retired Marine colonel, hosted a dinner or a barbecue one night. And I remember the two gentlemen to this day, Richard Schneider, who was a member of the Polish intelligence service, and then Ryszard Szoszyński. And Ryszard was the security officer at the Polish embassy in Washington. Just as a side note, Ryszard and his wife, Barbara was a physical therapist. And when my son was born, he had a massive brain hemorrhage and had some significant physical issues he was coping with. And Ryszard's wife, Barbara, as a physical therapist, came and worked with him and did just wonders. So I have a a fond regard for Poland in that regard. But Richard Snyder, his fame was when he was assigned to the Polish embassy in India, and he was being targeted by an officer with the Central Intelligence Agency who's trying to recruit him. What happened is that CIA person went out with Richard one day and woke up 3 days later, didn't know where he had been. So Richard had, managed to get access to the CIA in a way that was unusual. So what I'm saying with all of this is that Poland did not necessarily become a puppet right off the bat of the United States. I think it maintained somewhat of its independence. Well, what frankly puzzles me, and maybe you can provide some insight into this, is why Poland now has such an affinity towards Ukraine, particularly the Banderistas, when given the history of Bandera and his group, where they were murdering Poles in great numbers, in far larger numbers than what took place at the Katyn Forest Massacre. That's what I don't get.
But you see, why I've asked you this question, because to me, what's happening right now is very much connected with the directives that are coming from Washington. And I think the reasoning for this is the involvement of those kind of forces, like, for example, the agency is. And in Poland, by the way, later on, it was, what year was it? 2000, let me see, I've written this down, 2002 and 2003. We had, right after 9/11, shortly after 9/11, we had the secret CIA prisons that were first denied. The fact was denied by Polish president and Polish prime minister. And at the time it was Aleksander Kwaśniewski, by the way, connected to Burisma as well. And Leszek Miller was the prime minister. So they denied the fact. And in those prisons, I will ask you about this also a little bit later, because US apparently paid some amount of money because Polish were not so keen on this idea, apparently, but the money convinced them, so they went ahead with those prisons. And then certain people were transferred there to be tortured. So breaking the human rights, all those UN agreements. I'm not a lawyer, an expert in all of this. I'm just trying to understand the dynamics of many things that are going on right now. Like you've asked me about this certain love expression for Ukraine. I will answer this quickly here as far as why Polish people were so supportive for the refugees in the first moment, right after the conflict started there. I think it was the human nature, and Polish people really are great hosts. We have big hearts. So do Russian people as well, by the way. We know that. But they opened their hearts. And I think what was underneath that was also the level of how a lot of Polish still have this very unhealthy relationship with Russia. So that was on two levels. But I think that CIA is playing a very important part in Poland since that time of solidarity movement and the roundtable negotiations. And then we had other, people in the government that were playing with certain agendas. And right now, as you see this, what's going on, I also wonder how much of it is coming from US, because in my opinion, what's going on with Poland right now is not a sovereign decision of the Polish-speaking government, by the way. I always emphasize Polish-speaking government. People can do the research where certain family trees go, and they can see. But so Larry, now let's go back, because I think it's important. The idea of solidarity. In your opinion, what was taking place then in 1980, 1981? Was this created by CIA?
No, I don't think so. I think it was the CIA glommed onto it, attached itself to it, because they saw it as a way to try to counter the then Soviet Union. It is, it's fascinating given the position that Poland is in from an intelligence standpoint. I understand the resentment in Poland towards the old Soviet Union. I experienced some of that during my wife and I paid a visit to Poland. We went specifically to Auschwitz, Wiesn, and it was that we had a Polish guide, and it was really fascinating. There was sort of a lot of antagonism, animosity expressed in the course of his presentation, more towards the Soviets than towards the Nazis, even though it was the Nazis that, in fact, the camp was presented, particularly Auschwitz I, not Birkenau, was presented very much as a Polish prison camp, a camp where Polish dissidents and political figures were kept and tortured and abused, with little emphasis given to the Holocaust implications for the Jews. And when I brought it up, he got a little prickly, a little defensive. So you go back and you look at the history of this, that the Polish government in exile that wound up in London after the German and Russian invasion in 1939, and in the continued aspiration of that Polish exile government to return to Poland, and the fact that the Soviets were intent upon preventing them from coming back. And the story of the Soviet troops sitting outside of Warsaw as the uprising of the resistance was allowed to be crushed by the Nazis, and waiting until that was over to come in as a way to sort of further consolidate Soviet control over Poland. And I understand, from the Soviet standpoint, they wanted to have a buffer on their territory that would never be breached again. The imposition of the Soviet system, which was oppressive in many regards, left, I think, a lingering resentment. And then on top of that, the religious tension. So with Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church being so dominant in Poland, and having had the Pope come out of Poland as well, stood at opposition with the Eastern Orthodox Christian theology and movement. So, you get all these different threads bound up, and there's that inevitable tension. Now, the CIA, as a case officer working in that situation, you're going to try to identify people, individuals who'd be willing to cooperate with you. And you can find a variety of reasons that, we will help create a movement in Poland that will resist and oppose the Soviets. So from that standpoint, I think there were some relationships developed. I have myself no personal insight or experience with the CIA operations there, but just knowing how it would work, Poland was a ripe environment for recruiting people to come to work for us, is how I would view it.
Well, and now it's also a perfect ground in light of the situation with Ukraine.
Well, it is and it isn't. What's interesting, I have a friend who's he's the great grandson of the man who invented the Gatling gun. It was the early machine gun. He lives in Japan, and he's friends with a fellow Polish diplomat, military officer who'd served in Japan. And that individual is now back in Poland and was writing my friend saying, boy, you can't believe, these American soldiers are now in Poland and they're creating a bit of a problem, going into
Yes.
bars and getting drunk and getting into fights and
Mhm.
different things. And, it's not always
Mhm.
lollipops and cotton candy and balloons when the U.S. military shows up. It brings with it some other problems. So the fact that the U.S. is there now in a way that it has not been previously is, I'm sure, is welcomed by some in Polish society, but I think it's creating some real animus in other parts. And when we're all is said and done with respect to this war in Ukraine, what is being exposed is that the United States is weak, despite the claims of being the dominant superpower. What people are seeing is that the United States talks a good game, but it's incompetent. It can't even provide enough artillery rounds to keep the Ukrainians in good supply to fire at an equal rate to what the Russians are firing. And the United States dragging its feet on providing combat aircraft. That I think it'd be insane to provide combat aircraft. But it's just again, it's another example of the expectations that you have. You have the impression of the United States as I've used the analogy of the Wizard of Oz from that movie,
Mhm.
the great
Mhm.
and powerful Oz, and then the dog pulls back the curtain. You find it's just a little old man behind the screen who really is not all that powerful. I think that's what the war in Ukraine has exposed the United States as the little old man behind the curtain.
So here, actually, I will sidetrack for a moment from Poland. What is more dangerous, CIA or the fourth unelected branch of U.S. government?
What do you see as the fourth unelected branch?
The military complex, those generals
Oh,
who run the
uh,
show behind the curtain.
yeah, no, I would say it's the military industrial complex is
Okay.
really the gravest threat. The CIA is incompetent. I mean, it is just there's some good people there. Um, what people should pay attention to is the the extraordinary number of former CIA officers that are out and about, showing up on television, doing podcasts. Why didn't we stay? Because a lot of the people that you see out there they're bright and they're intelligent and they're capable. Why did they leave after 5 years or 7 years? What's wrong with CIA? Well, the problem is it's a very rigid bureaucracy. It actually is so it is analogous to what we used to believe about the Soviet Union and the KGB in terms of being a bureaucratically ossified system that was controlled by elderly men with no no welcoming of outside ideas or innovation. Uh, and to that extent, the unfortunate thing for the CIA is it's become so politicized. It's not a dark, powerful force of its own. It is always dependent upon others outside of the CIA in order to quote retain its power. Um, but the growth of the military-industrial complex is that's really what's endangering the United States, in my view. I've said on previous podcasts that when my wife and I first moved to Washington D.C. in August of 1979, I was there to start working on a PhD at the American University, and at the time there were no ultra luxury automobile dealerships in the area. You didn't have Ferraris and Lamborghinis, Bentleys, Rolls Royce. That didn't exist back then. It does now. And you've got to ask yourself, well, in the 40 years, 40 plus years since I first arrived, what changed? the change took place with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because when the Soviet Union fell, the entire reason for being for the defense industry was at risk. Because up to that point, we'd been able to justify increasing defense spending every year because we've got to confront the Soviet threat. Those Soviets they're coming to get us. Well, it went away. Now what? And facing this, oh gosh, who's the villain? I don't know if you've ever been involved with having to pitch a project out in Hollywood, but when you go out to pitch a project of a movie or a TV series, the question's always, who's the villain? Who's the bad guy? Because you need a good bad guy to drive the drama. Well,
yes, and actually, can I just say here, Larry, sorry to interrupt you, but from the writer perspective, actually, it is a great villain who makes even greater hero. Like you need a great villain because the contrast of it.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. So that in 1991, that started the search for the next great villain. There were still they stumbled around. Terrorism was not seen as the next great villain, and it took 9/11 to make terrorism the next great villain. But unfortunately, for the United States, for the military-industrial complex, that did not involve boosting spending in areas like anti-missile defense systems. In fact, George W. Bush, the president when 9/11 happened, ended the anti-ballistic missile treaty agreement. And Russia at the time under Putin was like, why are you doing this? And, we're going to go our own way. And out of that, it turned out to be a blessing for Russia. Russia developed robust anti-ballistic missile defense systems. The United States did not. The United States was so caught up with fighting Islamic insurgencies, some of which we ended up inadvertently creating. The invasion in Iraq in March of 2003 was an utter disaster in terms of unleashing a new wave of international terrorism by radical Islamic groups. The creation of ISIS really could be traced to what the United States did in Iraq. So, but throughout this, the United States began promoting, there were these other small conflicts. The first one was the war in the former Yugoslav Republic. So then Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, that became the first justification of using US military force when in conjunction with NATO. But out of that, you identify needs for the defense industry. So in a very sick way, the other aspect to this is generals in the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. When they retire, they were all of a sudden being cycled into these corporations. Some of the Lockheed Martins, the General Dynamics, the Raytheons, and other smaller ones that you've never heard of. And generals who had been accustomed to government paychecks were suddenly becoming multimillionaires. And their colleagues or former colleagues are going, oh, boy, that sounds like a great opportunity. I can't wait to get a hold of that. So it's really been a complete perversion of the U.S. defense system. And what we have now, you'll hear Donald Trump say the United States has the greatest military in the world. And no, that's a lie. It has the most expensive military in the world. It has, I've described it as a Lamborghini with no tires, sitting on cinder blocks and unable to really drive anywhere. You have these grossly expensive combat aircraft, the F-35, which its ability to stay alive if it flew into Russian airspace in a conflict would be, minutes, perhaps seconds. It's not sustainable. And it's not the kind of, you shoot that one down that you could automatically or quickly replace it in a month. You're talking years to replace one aircraft. The same with aircraft carriers. They're a legacy of the past. They're no longer relevant because of the development of hypersonic missiles, which Russia is the lead in the world. There's no other country that has developed as many and as effectively as Russia. So in that way, the US political system, it's become corrupted. The corruption in Washington, D.C., where people are making millions of dollars off of selling influence and selling access. I mean, I know firsthand, my next door neighbor where I lived when I lived in Bethesda, he was the largest defense lobbyist in town. And a huge part of his job was wining and dining members of Congress, or doing fundraisers for them, where he would bring corporate money into their offices so that they would be able to run again for re-election. And then in exchange for that, he would have an open door when he went to them to get them to vote for something that those companies, the defense industry, needed. So it's become a big business, a multi-hundreds of millions of dollars business.
It's a swamp. I mean, truly, right? Once you're in the swamp, like how you ever get out of it and what kind of purifying on your life you have to do after that. Because this is like recycling over and over again. It's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. But I want to ask you now here in this moment about something that I have been hearing about for several years, and it's a very important thing. And I don't think enough channels give much attention to it. Although, as I believe, it's very connected to many things, including the human trafficking. So DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, that is working on the BRAIN initiative. And what is this BRAIN initiative? So Obama in 2013 announced the launch of the BRAIN initiative project. And BRAIN stands for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. As I became aware, this particular project, it's kind of scary stuff here we're talking about, because there is a lot of human trafficking going on, and majority of people who end up being captured are used for certain experiments, let's just put this way. And this is one of the most important things on this planet as well going on, including all those wars, all those conflicts like now we have in Ukraine. How many people, how many children are missing? Not many people are talking about it, but this is one of the most lucrative businesses, if not the most lucrative businesses that exists in the world right now. And I would like to ask you, Larry, do you know anything about DARPA, and what do you think? Is there any CIA involvement in this, including human trafficking as well?
I don't think so from an institutional standpoint, simply because if that was going on, remember, these are bureaucracies. And it's really no different than what we saw with the Nazis running the concentration camps and the death camps. As I'm sure you know, the Nazis set up the death camps specifically in Poland, where they could carry out the mass executions from Auschwitz, Belzec, Komno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka. And they wrote down what they were doing. It wasn't like they had secret writing or that they used only voice messages to pass information. I mean, they documented. It was a bureaucracy. There money coming in, money going out. They had to account for it. Well, you've got the same thing with the CIA and even with DARPA. That's not to say that there are individuals that may work with those organizations that on their own or in concert with someone else are doing some of these heinous things. What I would like to see, it's partially documented already, but I don't have my mind fully around it, is the presence of all these biomedical laboratories, both in Ukraine, and now we're seeing that at least the National Institutes of Health was involved with funding a similar laboratory in Khartoum, Sudan. how many of these places around the world? Because I think what you raise is one of the possibilities, incentives for getting this money out into these institutions that are outside the United States is the hopes that you can do medical research that absolutely would not be permitted inside the United States. And is one of sort of the black marks of Auschwitz, particularly Birkenau, that it was used for medical experimentation, particularly with Dr. Joseph Mengele. In a way, the Mengele tradition appears to be lingering on, that there is some use of human beings against their will in medical experiments of different kinds. So the human trafficking as well is something that has been a problem in the United States that both Republicans and Democrats refuse to confront. Well, they're clearly from the standpoint of fueling the sex industry, as well as narcotics trafficking, as well as providing bodies that work in factories and food processing areas. I am happy to report that a friend of mine, he was the #2 guy at the U.S. Department of State's Office of Counterterrorism. He retired, moved to Iowa. He ran for the Iowa legislature, won, and he just managed to get a bill on dealing with human trafficking to stop it in Iowa, because Iowa has been a big problem in the United States because it has so many places to pig farm, plants for processing pigs, cows, chickens, turkeys, and inevitably these children are brought in. They end up being victimized. So there is, I call almost sort of I'm not sure it's an international organization, but there certainly are individuals around the world that are actively engaged in some of the most evil, vile activities with respect to trafficking women and children in particular. So, but with that said, I'm skeptical of the claim that DARPA's got some sort of secret walled-off compartment where this is being done and they're able to keep that secret. Because just in my experience, again, I've held top secret clearances. I've had what are called special access program. And it's just the way the information is walled off still doesn't mean that you can't find out about it or won't find out about it. If a whistleblower comes forward, then, clearly I'd have to change my view on it. But at the heart, these are still big bureaucracies, and they don't fund themselves. And as a result, there is always some measure of accountability or accounting that takes place. Whether or not they're actually held accountable for what they accomplish or do, that's a whole nother question.
So would you say, I would like to actually ask you this, what is really the role of CIA?
Depends. So when the CIA was set up, the idea initially was that the president needed to get all source intelligence, that had to really understand what was going on in the world, because we were into this new Cold War with the Soviet Union. So you had case officers, individuals, men and women, who their job was to go out and recruit foreigners to spy for us, to give us information, to betray their countries, to give us information and insight that those countries didn't want us to have. But part of that was so that we would know exactly what Soviet leadership was thinking. And personally, I'm all in favor of that, because the Russians do it, the Poles do it, any credible intelligence service, that's what they do. They try to find people in the governments where they have interests, so that they know exactly what they're thinking, so that you don't make any miscalculations. Then the analytical side of the house is supposed to take that information that's being generated and then integrate it with other sources of intelligence, such as intercepted communications, photographs from overhead imagery from satellites or drones, and then electronic, what they call ELINT, information collected, say, from emails and other kinds of communications. Integrate all of that so you can give the president an objective view. What happened in the 50s, starting in the 50s, is that they found out that they could use the CIA in covert action, where it could be used to carry out operations inside other countries to change governments and to build up interest with certain political parties or organizations that then could appear to act on their own. And that's where the CIA has gone completely astray. That's what's corrupted it. Because when you get into that kind of program, that program becomes the driving force. There is no incentive for anybody to come in and say, well, wait a second. So I give you an example. The creation of the coup in Maidan in February of 2014 was involved both CIA and British intelligence elements. Anybody that would have tried to come in as an analyst and say, well, wait a second, do you realize if we do this, we're going to further heighten the anxiety, the suspicion, and the anger in Russia, and it will increase the likelihood of conflict. If any analyst tried to raise that, they would have been fired. They would have been shut down. So because that was not supporting the policy. I ran into this firsthand because I was the Honduran analyst during the war in Central America when the United States was funding the Contras, trying to oust the Sandinista government. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua were receiving support from the then Soviet Union. And when we as analysts tried to write things about an objective assessment of the war, we were literally being attacked by the guys on the operations side, verbally attacked. They called us analysts, using the term anal is a polite way of, calling us assholes. But then they accused us of undermining the Contra effort. So that's how this covert action ends up corrupting the process. So why I sort of smiled or laughed at your question at the outset is what the CIA was supposed to be, it no longer is. It has become totally absorbed in this covert action world, and as such has lost its ability to do objective analysis free of independent political pressure. And that, I think, is something that any intelligence organization in the world needs. You need a group that's going to be able to come in and tell the political leaders the things they don't want to hear, because it might prevent them from doing some incredibly stupid things, which the United States right now is in the process of doing. Incredibly stupid things to provoke confrontations with both Russia and China, which the United States has no capability of carrying out.
Thank you for answering this, Larry. And in my humble opinion, when I think about CIA, I think it's an organization that creates regime changes, plural, color revolution, and is also probably #1 drug supplier to the countries.
Yeah, that one, no, I disagree. Because that
okay,
was one of the,
but there is part of it.
Yeah, that was one of the stories that came out of the whole war in Central America. And so I have actually some particular insight into this. So my other business partners, my consulting group, one was Bobby Nieves, Robert Nieves. Bobby, before joining, when we linked up with Berg Associates in 1998, prior to that, he was chief of international operations for DEA. And he was the one who set up what was called the Kingpin program to go after the kingpins in the drug world. If the reporter that did the article about the alleged trafficking, that the CIA was trafficking in cocaine out in San Diego, I forget the reporter's name, in his book, he identified my friend Bobby. So Bobby's last name, Nieves. In Spanish, the term for snow is nieve, nevar, to snow. Well, so this reporter claimed that Bobby's nickname was Bobby Snow. It was a lie. That was a complete, utter lie. That Bobby was helping facilitate the movement of drugs. You know, I've known Bobby for over 30 years. The last thing in the world you'd ever see from this guy, from Bobby, is involvement with drug trafficking. He was, you know, as straight as they come. And so were there elements in the Contras in Costa Rica that on their own were involved with drug trafficking? Yes. Were there people in the CIA that down there at the time in the station that could have known about it and may have known about it? Yes. But did the CIA do anything to stop it? No. It was one of those things, just, you know, look to the side, because that was not what the CIA was doing. The CIA was trying to overthrow the government, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So the CIA, it's one thing for the CIA to look the other way, but what I discovered, you know, my other partner was he ran DEA's undercover money laundering operations in New York City for 4 years. Well, what I've learned with working with my partners who were in light of their former DEA experience, DEA has far better sources and access than the CIA does overseas. The CIA is so targeted and focused on governments and official organizations that they really don't understand and get down into the underbelly of these countries and the criminal world that is, you know, rampant here in the United States as well as overseas. I think that a large part of the CIA image in the world is this dark, terrifying, all-powerful organization. It's a Hollywood myth, in my view. Because I've always told people, you know, they think of the CIA in terms of Sean Connery or Pierce Brosnan, the actors, you know, suave, debonair,
right?
You know, deadly.
But Larry, isn't it CIA working with CAA?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Yes. I mean, but the reality of CIA is it's more like the cartoon Dilbert that Scott Adams writes, a creature of the bureaucracy. I mean, just one quick story. It's anecdotal, but I think it illustrates how the CIA actually operates in reality. So during the height of the Contra War, the CIA finally got permission again to start providing aerial resupply to the Contras. So they had to get a base. So they set up a base off the coast of Honduras on a place called Swan Island. And they bought a bunch of aircraft and they brought this brand new, it was a Casa 212, I believe. And I understand it cost like $20 million. And so you got to remember, this was one of the top 5 US foreign policy objectives at that time. Fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan was one, fighting the Sandinistas in Central America, going after the Cubans and Angola. You know, those were like the big 3. So you think this is the top priority on the CIA objectives. So you're going to put your best person out in charge of those operations on Swan Island, right? Wrong. They put a guy out there who had his reputation was he was an alcoholic. And so the guy that was running the Central American Task Force at the time, Alan Fires, apparently was friends with this guy and wanted to give him a chance. So they put this character out at Swan Island to run things. And they brought in 2 Rhodesian pilots who were going to test fly the Casa 212 to make sure it could operate at night. And that had directional radar on it so it could find its way back to the island. But to find its way back to this island, there was a beacon. And so the CIA chief of base sends these 2 guys that go flying off late evening, getting dark. They fly out there. He goes back he takes the beacon with him, goes inside a concrete bunker. So now the signal is blocked, drinks a bottle of scotch, passes out. So he's unconscious. Meanwhile, here are these 2 Rhodesian pilots flying around the Caribbean in the dark trying to find the island. And they can't find it. Now, understand, they got a brand new $20 million airplane. And finally, they run out of gas. They have to ditch the plane in the Caribbean. It sinks to the bottom. They float around in a raft for a day or two until they're picked up by a Soviet trawler. So,
no, it's like a screenplay. This is like a screenplay.
Yeah. So it's just when you think, again, another one of my CIA classmates, he was sent to Costa Rica on his first tour as a case officer, and he was asked to follow up and verify because his predecessor, the guy he was replacing, had recruited supposedly 3 or 4 assets, people that were providing information about what was going on inside Nicaragua. Well, my friend discovered that his predecessor had fabricated all of these alleged sources. They didn't exist. So my friend ends up exposing that. He gets a cash award for it. But what do you think happened to the guy that fabricated those things? Oh, he was promoted. He went on to become chief of station in Romania. So, wow. I mean, it's just, I got story after story after story like that. So that's the CIA I knew, that you had, the guy Burton Gerber, who was the head of the Soviet division during the height of the Cold War. It turned out, I learned subsequently that he was a closeted homosexual. And this was at the time that the CIA was preventing any homosexuals, as part of their polygraph from joining the agency. It was considered a lifestyle issue. So I just said, just lots of hidden secrets and such, but Hollywood has done an extraordinary job, and Tom Clancy, of making the CIA appear to be this incredibly competent outfit. And it does some things well, but it's been also in large measure a bit of a clown show, an expensive clown show, in my view.
Yes. It sounds to me like the deep state is not only creating these scenarios that they want us to live as a reality, but then they are also having a lot of stories, like you said, that is truly a screenplay for the movie, for many movies. But I have 2 questions, if we have time, Larry, to ask you.
Sure.
First is about Putin. And as we were talking about the villain that has to exist, do you think they will ever remove this label from Putin of the villain?
No. It's so set. It's irrational. The view of Putin in the West is totally, completely irrational. They make Putin into a cartoon figure, an evil. He's the ultimate Boris Badenov. That was from the Rocky Bullwinkle cartoon series. You had Boris and Natasha, the evil Soviet spies. But the anger at Putin, I think, revolves around 2 things. One, he shut down the corrupt activities of the oligarchs and their American investors, the Americans that were aligned with those oligarchs. He killed that. So that made a lot of very powerful people in the West very angry, because they were licking their chops, looking to devour what the natural resources in Russia. The second aspect is Putin is not woke, and is because of his religious conviction with respect to being Eastern Orthodox Christian. He has rejected completely, firmly, the LGBTQ, the homosexual agenda that has been so prevalent in the West. And there are prominent homosexuals throughout the CIA, throughout the State Department, throughout media, throughout corporations that resent this. And they see Putin as a hateful figure that must be stopped. Some may think I'm crazy in raising that, but I think that is absolutely one of the things that's driving this hatred of Putin. Because when you step back and look at it objectively in terms of acts, Putin is portrayed as this recreation of Joseph Stalin intent on conquering the world. Well, I said, okay, how many military operations has Russia carried out overseas since 1991? Or since 1999, since Putin's been in? Two, you had the war in Georgia, the short war in Georgia, precipitated by the Georgians and at the encouragement of the West. And then you have the special military operation in Ukraine. That's it. Russia's not been out with expeditionary military forces. It is in Syria at the invitation, specific invitation of the government of Syria. That's a legitimate way to go overseas with your military force, and has proven very effective and really has thwarted the U.S. effort to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. That's also another source of anger on the part of the West. But apart from that, what Putin has done over the last 20 years is transformed Russia's infrastructure. The people I know that were there in 1999, they used the term shithole and to describe what Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities and were like in Russia at that time. Unclean, dirty, unworkable. They are now, it's a dramatic transformation, because Russia has not spent the last 20 years pouring billions of dollars, actually approaching $1 trillion into wars overseas, unlike the United States. When you add up the total sum that the United States has spent over the last 20 years, we're approaching $1 trillion in places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. You know, the bills go up. And so Russia has literally been transformed. And this hatred, it's not just a Putin, it is a hatred of Russia. And this conviction that Russia is really something like subhuman, Untermensch, to use the German term. And that has, that mindset has become fixed and set in the West, unfortunately. I mean, I'm doing my part to try to alter that. It's not to say that Russia's perfect and that Putin always makes great decisions. You know, he's human. But I laugh when they want to talk about the corruption of Putin when we got Joe Biden sitting in the White House, the big guy getting his and raking off his 10% and lining up all these international business deals, please. So it is there was a time when the United States genuinely believed that it was the city on the hill, sort of a beacon of light to the world covered in darkness. Actually, when you look at what the United States has been doing over the last 20 years, we're the prince of darkness. We're the ones causing death and mayhem around the world, not Russia and not China.
Yeah, and this is my last question here, Larry. Afghanistan was one of the biggest failures for United States, right? I would like to ask you, in your opinion, do you think that the biggest will be Ukraine or China if it happens for US? The biggest failure?
Well, the United States appears to be intent on engaging in a war with China. And if it does that, it will be the end of the United States militarily. The only thing the United States could do is use nuclear weapons against China, and that would be suicidal. The alliance that has now been formed, and people say, "Oh, the Russia and China didn't sign a treaty." There is a de facto alliance now between China and Russia that is transformative in terms of the history of the world, and it's going to alter what the United States can do. Ukraine is going to be the first blow. It is going to wake up the United States to the reality that its power is quite constrained and limited, and it has been unable to defeat Russia, because Russia will win this, and in the process will expose NATO as completely impotent on the world stage, which may lead to a complete fracturing of NATO. But at the same time, the United States shows no sign of taking its foot off the gas in terms of a confrontation with China. It's crazy, because when the change in language that China is our enemy as opposed to an adversary, the constant portrayal again of China is this imperialist power bent on devouring the world. And I keep reminding people, when was the last country that China, quote, invaded, sent military forces to, was Vietnam in 1979. So, we're looking back over 44 years of China not sending out military forces into other countries. The only country in the world that has consistently been sending military forces into other countries against the will of those countries is the United States. And I'm not trying to badmouth my own country, but for God's sake, we got to call it what it is. It's not an imaginary thing. And that it has been the United States' willingness to use military force in such reckless ways that have not produced peace, that have not produced stability, we've got to come to grips with that. And I think the hubris of the moment is the United States. The only way it's going to discover the limits of its power is it's going to lose one of these military engagements. I mean, the reality is we didn't win in Iraq, we didn't win in Afghanistan, but boy, you listen to former generals like David Petraeus talk, and you think he was Zhukov who conquered Berlin and drove out the Nazis. I mean, it's just crazy stuff.
So do you think that they're going to replace the label? Let's say this. Do you think they will replace the #1 villain that Putin is right now with president of China?
Yes. Yeah, that's where it's headed.
Okay. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, no, these are terrifying times. I've never, I'm an old guy now, and I've lived through the Cold War, most of the Cold War. Well, I was born in 1955. So I've never seen a time of greater danger than we are now, because the danger is created by the United States leadership that is totally divorced from reality. They live in a fantasy world, and it's really reminiscent of the Adolf Hitler presented in the movie Downfall.
I just wanted to. Yes.
Yeah, he's in the bunker and ordering armies that don't exist, go here and there, and without recognizing, hey, dude, it's over. You've lost. The United States has not come to grips with that. And again, part of it is the financial interest at stake in this massive military industrial complex is, I mean, we're over, it's trillions of dollars, frankly, at stake.
Yeah, you just reminded me that scene actually with Charlie Chaplin. I remember this very well when he was playing with the globe.
Yeah, the giant balloon in the shape of the globe. Yeah.
Yes, this moment just came back to my mind. But I think we will end this conversation here. I'm very, very grateful for your insights today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I hope we can connect again. Maybe we can talk to Andrea as well, 3 of us, because I have some questions that I think if I will ask both of you, and you will give 2 perspectives, probably that are very much alike, I assume, but from 2 different experts, that would be interesting. So I saved some questions for you, actually, for the future if we connect again.
Okay, well, Anya, I'd be most pleased to appear again with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Please share in the comments down below your thoughts on our discussion, and you will find the links to Mr. Johnson down below this video to follow his work as well. Thank you, guys, and until next time.